down in Barrel in the Southern Highlands. We're about an hour and a half south of Sydney. We run our vineyard all biodynamically, and then we run sheep in the vineyard for the whole growing season, which means we use the tractor about 60% less, and that's where our name comes from. So we're quite a little sustainable label. We do a lot of things like we've got solar on the roof. I'm doing some work with some geothermal people. We do these bottles we use actually special low carbon bottles. So about half the carbon of a normal bottle, which also makes them a lot lighter. And so, all these little things we do to try and be a little bit more sustainable. I'd love to ultimately do something where we are a winery completely off the grid. Some of the technologies aren't quite there yet, but definitely it's going to be pretty soon. So I'm pretty excited about those sorts of things. But you don't want to hear about me talking about all these experiments and ideas I have of becoming biodynamic. Becoming sustainable. Let's taste some wines, because that's why we're here. So we're going to work our way down the list, starting at the top. We're going to start with our Sauvignon Blanc. Guys, you're given a 50 ml bottle, which is actually quite a big taste. So if you're just doing this by yourself and not sharing it, those bottles could probably do 2 or 3 people. If you do the whole bottle, you might struggle to keep up. And so I'd suggest maybe just doing half the bottle if you're doing it by yourself. Otherwise, I might move a little bit fast for everyone. All right. So Sauvignon Blanc, I'm actually normally not a massive fan of Sauvignon Blanc. I sometimes find that they're just a little bit too much fruit, heaps of fruit all in your face all at once. It's just a bit overpowering. And so I actually make this in a fumé style. And a fumé style is a style that originates in Bordeaux in France. And the Sauvignon Blancs there have this really nice flinty, matchsticky sort of character to them. And to get that, they use oak. And so in Australia, New Zealand, America, now when we make a Sauvignon Blanc and it's 100% or predominantly oak fermented, we call it a fumé style. And I prefer those styles. You still get the nice flavors and textures of a Sauvignon Blanc, but the oak just really mellows them out a bit. And it gives you some nice oaky characters as well. So it's kind of like a mellowed out Sauvignon Blanc, which really suits my sort of personality a little bit more and suits my winemaking a little bit more. That's sort of what I like to drink. So Sauvignon Blanc, let's give it a go. So the other interesting thing you'll notice in our Sauvignon Blanc, we get this really nice range of flavors. And that's because we do a double harvest. So we harvest half the grapes at around about 9 Baumé. Now when I say Baumé, it's actually a sugar level of grapes. So just like you've got all these different ways of measuring temperature, degrees Celsius, degrees Fahrenheit, degrees Kelvin, it's the same for sugar. So we can measure it in Brix, we can measure it in Baumé, we can measure it in specific gravity. There's all these different measurements. I like to use Baumé, and that's because 1 Baumé, when it's fermented with yeast, ends up being 1% alcohol. So it's just a really nice, easy sort of conversion and a nice scale to use. So if during this tasting, if I ever say Baumé or percentage, they're pretty much the same. 9 Baumé, which is when we harvest half of the Sauvignon Blanc, will convert to 9% alcohol when it's finished fermenting. So we harvest half of it at 9%. And this gives us that really nice, crisp, green apple, little bit of lantanery character to it, and a bit of freshness on the palate. We then harvest the second half at around about that 12.5 to 13% alcohol. And then that gives us that more passion fruity, tropical characters in the wine. And you'll see we've got that full flavor spectrum, and that's how we get that those flavors in the Sauv Blanc. And then when you taste it, you get that beautiful crispness from that early picking part of it, but you also get these really nice furry textures, which comes from the oak part, and that nice vanilla-y character as well. And that's one of the things I love about this style, is that more mellowed out flavors and then that sort of oaky vanilla-y finish to it. If you guys have a Edam or a nice Jarlsberg or something in front of you there, that's a really nice match for the Sauvignon Blanc. Um, it's it shows you a little bit how cold we are here in the Southern Highlands. Like, a lot of people don't realize how cold we are because we're only about an hour and a half south of Sydney. A lot of people think we're similar temperature to Sydney. We're super cold. So some years we actually even harvest after Tasmania. So it's that cool down here. And that's because of our height. Our lowest vineyard in the Southern Highlands here is above 500 meters. And because of that height, we get a lot cooler temperatures. And that's one of the key things for these boutique cool climate wines is we want nice warm days, but really cold nights. And what that does is it really slows down the ripening of the grapes. And the slower the ripening of the grapes, the more time the grapevine has to develop flavor in the berries. And so if you're in a really warm climate region, what happens is the sugars ripen really quickly and the flavors are trying to keep up. And so you end up with a very thin flavor profile because the grapes haven't had time to lay down all these layers. And so these cool climate regions like ours, just because it takes so much longer to get to that sugar ripeness, it just gives the grapevines a lot more time to build up the flavor profile in the wine. You know, these tropical flavors and these passion fruity flavors that you get in Sauv Blanc, they're a good show of how cold it is here in the Highlands. You don't get those flavors in a really warm region. They're only in quite cool regions. And it just means that, you know, varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, Grigio Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, they're sort of the key varieties that do really well in this region because of the temperatures. Everyone comes into the cellar door, always asks me what's the difference between a Grigio and a Gris. And that's one of the reasons we go look at the two, is because we can talk about these differences. So we're going to slowly move on to the Grigio. Now, Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris are both made from the exact same grape variety, which is the Pinot Gris grape variety. Grigio is the Italian way of making it, and Gris is the French way of making it. So the first thing is their philosophies about winemaking are really quite different. The Italians, to an extent, we could say the Italians are making a wine specifically for a food. That's not 100% correct because you know, they're not that closely related to the food, but they are definitely very conscious as a winemaker what the wine is going to be drunk with or eaten with when it's finished. And so it's definitely in their mindset, and that has an effect on the way they make their wine. The French, on the other hand, are more concerned about the wine, just the wine itself, and less concerned about what it's going to go with. So we end up with very different styles. Pinot Grigio, if you think about Italy, there's a lot of warm climate, a lot of maritime areas, so a lot of seafood. So the Italians are trying to create something that's zippy and crisp and fresh, has a nice steely palate, and, you know, something that's going to go really well with seafood. So to do that, the first thing they do is they harvest it quite early, and they're harvesting it at around about that 11 to 12% alcohol. And what happens is, as you get a grape, as it matures, the sugar levels slowly go up and the acid levels slowly go down. And so if we want to make a wine that's a little bit more acidic and a little bit crisper, we harvest it a little bit earlier. And so that's what we're doing with this Pinot Grigio in the Italian style. We're harvesting it nice and early, around about that 11 to 12% alcohol. It gives us a little bit more fresh acid in there. We then oxygenate it. So the Italians are not afraid of oxygen at all. And what I do when I make this wine, after pressing off the grapes into a tank, I fill a bucket with the juice from the bottom, and then I tip it in the top, and I fill it from the bottom and I tip it in the top. And I might do this 10 or 20 times until the juice goes all brown. And then I give it a really long, slow, cold ferment. And by browning the juice and adding that oxygen in there at the beginning of the ferment, that really helps me get that nice steely palate and really bit of green apple character in the wine. And you'll taste that. When you taste that, You can definitely see that Italian crisp, zippy sort of line to it. This wine is one of my favorite food matches with this wine is down the South Coast. They do these really beautiful little South Coast oysters. They're really sweet. Those oysters match with this wine, I reckon, is like a match made in heaven. It's fantastic. And one of the hard things about Pinot Grigio and also other Italian varieties and styles is because they are quite designed to go with food. If you're in a cellar door situation where often you're tasting wines without food, you've got to be really careful that you don't overlook these wines. And so sometimes I'll go back to them again, or I'll spend a bit more time looking at them in the cellar door so that I don't miss anything in them. You'll see when we move on to the Pinot Gris, and we'll slowly do that next, how if we don't spend a bit of time on these delicate styles like the Grigio, how easy it could be to let the bigger styles overpower it. So Pinot Gris next is, so this is the French way of doing it. So both made from the Pinot Gris grape variety. Grigio is the Italian way of doing it, and Gris is the French way of doing it. A little bit confusing, but it might get a bit more confusing as I go along. So the first thing you'll notice in the Pinot Gris, it's got this quite dark, sort of like a bronzy color to it. And you'll probably see it more in your little sample bottles, but you can definitely see it in your glass as well. And that's because of the ripeness of it. Now, you remember I said that the Italians are thinking about food and they're thinking about climate, and so they're making this zippy style. And the French are just thinking about the wine. So if we think about France, most of the Pinot Gris is grown in Alsace, which is on the French-German border. So it's quite cool climate. The French want a wine to stand by itself. So that doesn't mean that it's not going to go with food, because they still match beautifully with food. It just means that when they're making it, they're just thinking about the wine and the wine itself. So they're trying to create a big, round, soft, voluptuous style of wine. So the first thing they do is they harvest it nice and late. So it's about probably 3 to 4 weeks after the Italians harvest it is when the French harvest it. And as a result, their alcohol levels and their sugar levels are a bit higher. And we're looking at about that 13 to 14% alcohol mark. Now, Pinot Gris is an interesting variety. As it gets riper, it starts to develop a bit of color. So at that lower levels that they see in Italy, the berries are still quite green on the grapevine. As it gets riper, as it gets closer to that 13, they start to get a little bit of a pink color in the skins. And when a bunch of grapes is hanging in the vineyard still, they get this dusting, this light sort of dusting of yeast on the outside of them. And so when you've got the pink underneath and that dusting on the outside, from a distance, the bunches actually look gray. And that's where the name came from. So this is a Pinot because it's one of the Pinot, it's like a relation to all the other Pinots. So it's related, it's like cousins of the Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier and those varieties. And when you see the bunches, they look gray on the grapevine, and Gris is gray in French. And so that's where the name came from, Pinot Gris. Anyway, because of this ripeness levels, that's why you see this gray stuff. So in Italy, they don't really see that color so much in the grapevines because they're harvesting it a lot earlier. The French style, we're making this big style, so we harvest it a lot later, so we see this color. And as a result, we get this little bit of bronzing in the wine when it's finished. And sometimes even in some years, it can also go a little bit pink, but it's usually got bronzing things. So that's one of the first things we notice in the two wines because of these ripeness levels. The second thing is, when you look about here on your glass, there's this rim of clear liquid, and then it's running down like legs back into the wine. And we do call this legs. And what this is the volatile components of the wine. And when I talk about volatile components, it's the components of that wine that evaporate out at room temperature, and then they condensate around the top here and they dribble back in. Now, this is predominantly alcohol, and that's why that line wasn't as obvious in the Pinot Grigios, because we don't have as much alcohol. And this does something really interesting. If you smell this wine, and you think back to the smell of the Pinot Grigio, you would probably say to me that the Pinot Gris is a lot more aromatic because it definitely jumps out of the glass a lot more. But if I was to analyze the aromas of the Pinot Grigio and analyze the aromas of the Pinot Gris, the Grigio actually has a lot more than the Gris. And what's happening is this alcohol, as it's evaporating out of this wine, it's grabbing on other flavors that aren't actually aroma flavors, but it's grabbing onto them and releasing them into the air up here in the top of your glass. And as a result, we get this really perceived sort of aromatic to the wine. It's a really interesting thing on how the alcohol can affect those aromas on the wine. And it's a good example of what I was talking about before, is how you can overlook those Italian styles, because those Grigio, when you have that Grigio sitting on your mouth and eating food, the flavors will come out and develop more and more and more, and you'll start to see all these aromas. With this, the Gris, quite often you don't get you get a little bit, but not much flavor development. Once you get that flavor, the flavor's there, it's sort of given to you, and it doesn't develop more, whereas the Grigio does. And so it's one of the interesting differences, and that's all because of this alcohol pulling out all that aroma with it as it evaporates out. The next thing you'll see when you taste it is it's big and round and soft and fruity and a little bit oily. And that little bit viscosity, we call that glycerol. It's like a glycerol-y feeling. And that's one of the key things we're looking for in a really nice Pinot Gris, is that little bit of viscous sort of mouthfeel to it. And that actually comes from fermenting a higher sugared wine, so that 13 to 14% alcohol, and fermenting it slightly warmer, and that helps us get that mouthfeel. Now, because we're fermenting it warmer, the French don't want to lose too many aromas by fermenting it warmer, because that's what happens when you ferment it warmer. So what the French do to try and help this is they do everything under carbon dioxide cover. So Italians used oxygen. French, super afraid of oxygen. Everything under carbon dioxide cover. When they transfer it from barrel or when they transfer it from tank to tank, you first fill up both the tanks with carbon dioxide before you transfer it. So two very different techniques there. You know, if I hadn't told you they're from the same variety, you probably wouldn't believe me. It's amazing. So it's a really good example of how viticulturalists and winemakers can affect the final wine. And you know, we've got at one end of the spectrum here, we've got our Pinot Grigio. At the other end of the spectrum here, we've got our Pinot Gris. And then we've got all these variations in between. And at some point in the middle, we've got this bit of a crossover zone. And that's one of the reasons why these varieties are really quite complex, and a bit confusing for us as consumers, because there's really a lot of different styles. The other thing in Australia is that Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio is not a defined legal label term. As in, if I make a wine, I can label it either. So it's a bit confusing. And I've actually worked for big companies before where we've made a wine, and then depending on what the marketers thought would sell better that month, they either labeled it Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio. So, you know, a little bit confusing for us poor consumers. What you can do at the moment is have a look at the back of the bottle and have a look at the alcohol percent. If it's around 11 to 12% or low 12s, it's going to be a Pinot Grigio. If it's at 13 to 14% or high 12s even, it's probably more likely to be a Gris. If it's sort of in that middle mark, well, it's going to depend on how the winemaker made it, which style it's going to be. So it is starting to change. 2-3 years ago, if I entered a wine in a wine show, I'd enter it as a wine made from the Pinot Gris grape. Now, when I enter in a wine show, I either enter it as a Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris. And what that means is over the next sort of 3 or 4 years, that will define the two styles. So if I was to take this Grigio, which is a beautiful Grigio, and to put it into a Pinot Gris class, it would get 0 marks because it's not a Pinot Gris, it's a Pinot Grigio. And when the wine show eventually defines these styles and where the cutoff is and really clearly can define it, then eventually that will flow on to labeling law, and we'll actually be able to walk into a bottle shop and really clearly know what's a green, what's a Grigio. So, I love getting couples in the cellar door, and even today, and we're starting to open up a little bit down here. And I was at the markets this morning, and whenever we get couples, one always likes one and one always likes the other. So it's a bit of a conversation starter, I think. We're going to slowly move on to our Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is a really fun variety for me to make, and I love asking everyone whether they drink Chardonnay, and I get a lot of maybes, yes. I think 20% of people say yes, and which is really funny because the biggest selling white wine in Australia every year is Chardonnay, and the biggest selling white wine in our cellar door is Chardonnay. And so I have this theory that we're all closet Chardonnay drinkers. Chardonnay to me is all about balance. We went through this crazy evolution in Australia where, when was it, in the 70s and 80s, it was super, super oaky. And then late 90s, early 2000s, it was super, super just fruity, no oak. Anyway, now we're finding a nice balance in between the two. I like to see a little bit of oak. I like to see a little bit of those buttery flavors, and I like to see a little bit of fruit, but I don't want to see too much of anything. I just want to see a little bit of everything. And Chardonnay is a variety for a winemaker where every tiny little thing I do as a winemaker, you can taste it in the final wine. And so that makes it really fun to make. It also makes it really scary to make, because if I do something wrong, it's really obvious in the final wine. And that also is how we can really influence those balances of oak and fruit and butteriness. Now, if any of you guys have a nice fromage dauphinois or a really good triple cream brie sort of thing in front of you, that is a beautiful match for this Chardonnay. And those brie sort of creamy cheeses does is it brings out the buttery flavor in the Chardonnay, and it also brings out the sweet fruit flavor. It's a really nice match, and that buttery flavor is actually something that's really quite interesting. So most of our wines, well, all of our wines go through one ferment. Our Chardonnay and our red wines actually go through two ferments. The first fermentation is done with a yeast, and it takes the alcohol, it takes the sugar and ferments it with a yeast to alcohol. So it's probably one of the most, I guess, important fermentation processes, because it gives us the alcohol in our wine. The second ferment is actually done with a bacteria, and it takes the malic acid, which is the acid that you find in an apple, so that kind of crisp, fresh acid, and it converts it with a bacterial fermentation into lactic acid, which is the acid that you find in a milk. So it's sort of a softer, creamier acid. And a byproduct of this fermentation is this buttery flavor. Now, it was in the middle of the 80s, one of the wine writers in Australia said, I am so sick of these buttery Chardonnays. And so the companies that produce this bacteria actually started selecting against these buttery flavors. So now when I go to and buy a commercially available strain of bacteria, I don't get much of these buttery flavors in the wine. And what we've done is we found an heirloom bacteria, and we use 5% of that in our barrels, and that just gives us enough buttery flavor. And you can taste definitely, when I taste that wine, those buttery flavors are definitely obvious there, but they're not overpowering. And you could imagine if we used 100% of our barrels were with that bacteria, it would just be way too overpowering, that butteriness. So we just use 5%. We also only use old oak, so I don't use any new. I use all 2, 3, 4, and sometimes 5-year-old oak, because that first year, the oak is really in your face and too much, and I don't want that to overpower the wine. And so, to me, this is a nice balanced Chardonnay. A little bit of oak, a little bit of butteriness, a little bit of fruit, but nothing out of joint, all in line with each other. And I think Australia on a whole is actually starting to make some really amazing Chardonnays more and more, the more we get our hands around these nice balances. And I hope one day soon it might become trendy to drink Chardonnay again, so we don't have to all hide in the closet and pretend that we don't drink it. But I hope some of you guys get a little bit excited about drinking Chardonnays again with this one. Next, we're going to look at rosé. So one of the things interesting about rosé is you'll see we've got them in these little bottles. So these are actually a 500 ml bottle. And the reason I put them in the 500 ml bottles is, to me, rosé is a summertime wine. It's a lunchtime wine. And so, I mean, that doesn't mean I only drink it at lunchtime. Actually, I drink it all the time. But, you know, these 500 ml bottles means that two people can drink a bottle over lunchtime and still be under the limit to go back to work. And so that's why I put it in these little bottles. Unfortunately, I can't get these little bottles anymore. So next year, someone's going to have to either not go back to work, or we might not be able to drink the whole bottle over lunchtime. The other thing you'll see is that color, and you'll probably see it more in your wine, in your glass there anyway. And that color is definitely not trendy in rosé market at the moment. So at the moment, the trendy thing in the rosé market is those like really pale Provence, southern France style rosés. I've never been a trend follower, and so I am a huge fan of texture in my wine. So you'll notice all those white wines we've tasted so far, you can smell them, you can taste them, but you also get this real sort of funky, cool textural component to them in your mouth, and you really can feel them as well. And that's quite important for me as a winemaker, to be able to feel the wines as well. To do that with the rosés, I need to leave it with the skins a longer period of time, and that's why we get a darker color. So a lot of people don't realize that if I take a red grape and I squeeze it, the juice and the pulp inside is actually white. So to make a red wine, what I have to do is ferment it with the skins to extract all that color. To make a rosé, I leave it with the skins for like a period of time to get the color or the flavor or the texture that I want. So those sort of Southern France blush, light colored rosés, they probably spend about an hour with the skins before they're pressed off. Our rosé, I it with the skins and then taste it every 2 or 3 hours until just there on the middle of my tongue, when I get this nice little furry feeling, that's when I press it off. And usually that's around about that 10 to 12 hour mark. And that's why we get that darker color, because it's been sitting with the skins for 10 to 12 hours. And unfortunately, that dark color is a little bit of a marketing thing for us, because people see dark and they immediately remember Mateus Rosé. They think this is going to be sweet, but it's actually a bone dry rosé. So 100% Pinot Noir. That's how we get those nice strawberry characters to it. Nice and dry, a little bit of texture in the mid palate. This is my style of rosé. I love this style of rosé. Really good match for like charcuterie board or antipasta. Definitely a nice dry style rosé. One of the great things about these virtual tastings is I actually get to enjoy the wines with you guys. Normally I'm in the cellar door and I've got to drive home, and so I don't get to try the wines, or I've got to be careful not to try the wines all day. But here I'm at home, so it's great. I can have a wine with you all. So it's very exciting for me. Starting to get used to all of these virtual tastings. We're definitely going to keep doing them. So that rosé, people think that's because you get that real strawberry character in there, and that's from the Pinot Noir. People sometimes ask me, "Oh, how do you get that? Are you adding strawberries? Are you adding strawberry flavor? What's the go? How's this work?" And something that's really interesting with grapes and amazing with grapes is if I take a strawberry and I analyze the chemicals found in that strawberry, there is a chemical in there, a flavonoid, which is a strawberry flavor. And a strawberry can only make a strawberry flavor flavonoid. If I do the same with a passion fruit can only make a passion fruit flavored flavonoid. If I take a grape and analyze all the flavors and the chemicals in a grape, I can actually find all these other flavors. And the grape is the only fruit in the world that has the ability to create every other flavor of all these other fruits, which makes it a really amazing fruit. And the French talk about terroir. And what's happening with terroir is, depending on where the grape is growing and the soil and the sunlight and the rain conditions and all those things that affect it every year, depending on all those things, the grape will produce different flavors. And it's kind of like a thumbprint for a grape, is this flavor spectrum that's laid down. So the French call it terroir, and it's how these masters of wine, these really good wine tasters, are able to isolate different vineyards and different regions by the taste, is because a vineyard will be really specific, the tastes it makes on a year by year level. And so it's one of the really cool things about boutique wines over big company wines. If I'm making, I've done a lot of big consulting to a lot of big companies, and if I'm making something for a big company, they want their Shiraz to be the same every year. So they're blending grapes from all over a country or all over a region, so that every year their Shiraz tastes the exact same every year. From a boutique producer, I want my Shiraz to taste different according to the year. So example might be, one year it'll be a really hot year, so we might get some more raspberry characters or some more plum characters in the Shiraz. One year might be a really cold year, so we might get a little bit more spicy characters in the Shiraz. And the idea is that I can then sit down with 5 or 10 years worth of Shiraz in front of me and go, oh yeah, that was 1997. That was a cold year. And this is 98. And that was a warm year. And you can actually go through and taste the differences. And that's one of the really cool things that I love about boutique regions and boutique producers, is that you can actually really look at the differences from a year to year basis. And that's all thanks to the grapes being able to produce all these other flavonoids from all the other fruits that are around. So let's move on to reds. Down here, starting to get a bit chilly, so I am definitely drinking probably more reds than whites. The first red we're going to look at is our Lost Flock. This is our old labels. So all our new labels look like this. This was before I could afford an artist to draw them. This was actually designed, I was sitting in front of my fire and I was enjoying a nice glass, a big Barossa red, which I love. But I sometimes feel that I can only have a glass or two and they're just too heavy and over the top. And so I wanted to make something that, you know, had that texture and that nice velvety tannin and that long sort of raspberry aftertaste that you get in a nice Barossa red, but without being so heavy. It was a little more delicate. And so that's how I came up with the Lost Flock. It's essentially a GSM, so Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre, but it also has a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot in it. And this is my everyday, easy drinking red. It's probably the red I drink the most of. It's probably the red I take to a dinner party the most. You know, you go to your friends' places and some people like Shiraz and some people like Merlot and some people like Grenache. Well, you know, you bring a blend, everyone can find a flavor that they like there. And so that's why I quite like taking blends with me. This wine is something special to us. It's called the Lost Flock. And one of the things with biodynamic winemaking and organic winemaking is we do it when we make our decision in the winery and vineyard to go biodynamic or organic. It's a philosophical decision. It's not a financial decision, because if I take a Shiraz and I put it in a bottle shop, it's probably valued at $30. If I take an organic Shiraz and put it in the bottle shop, it's still valued at $30. At the moment, you know, the market doesn't perceive organic and biodynamic any higher than a normal wine. Now, the problem is that it actually is a lot more expensive to grow that fruit. And one of the main reasons is management of the grass. So a non-biodynamic or an industrial vineyard, all they have to do is herbicide the whole lot, or they herbicide strips under the grapevines and then mow the rest. And so it's a lot cheaper to run those sort of vineyards. For biodynamics and organics, our biggest expense is managing that grass. Now, in 2014, we had a caterpillar problem in our vineyard. And the biodynamic principle says if you've got caterpillar problems in your vineyard, or if you've got insect problems at all on your property, it's because you don't have enough animals on your property. So we started experimenting with sheep. First I decided to try Dorpers because they're shedding sheep. It means we wouldn't have to shear them. It might make it a bit easier. Well, a Dorper is pretty much a goat. So they ate half the vineyard. So that experiment did not work at all. That was a definite failure. Next, I grew up on a merino farm. And so merinos are what we call grazers. Now, a Dorper is a browser. And what that means is when they're looking for food, they look everywhere and they'll just eat whatever they can see. A grazer, like a merino, means they only look within their feeding zone. And when they run out of food in their feeding zone, then they'll look elsewhere. So as long as there's food in their feeding zone, they're not going to look elsewhere. So the merinos kind of worked. The bunches hung down a little bit into their feeding zone. And so we used to run electrical wires just under the bunches, which stopped the sheep from touching them. Unfortunately, electricity goes out. You'll be amazed at what a sheep can eat in one day. So, that kind of worked, but that experiment didn't work really to warrant keep doing it. Eventually, we found this breed called Hampshire Downs. They're from the UK. They're those shorter, they're a little bit shorter, and they've got these black faces to them. They're grazers as well, and so they're only going to feed in their feeding zone. And the difference is merinos, the grapevines sat here, and the Hampshire Downs, the grapevines sit here. And that 2 inches different means that all of a sudden the grapes are gone from within the feeding zone to outside the feeding zone. So now we can actually run those sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing season. And it solved our caterpillar problem. It's also had another side effect, which I don't know why I didn't think about at the time, but guess what? Sheep eat grass. And so now all of a sudden I've solved my grass problem as well. So our biodynamic vineyards now are probably on par to an industrial vineyard for cost. So it's really changed things for us. We're starting to get pretty good at how we manage these sheep now. And what we've worked out is once a year we do this second, it's a process in the vineyard we call leaf plucking. And if you can imagine, we've got a bunch of grapes hanging down, and what happens is the leaves cover those grapes like this. And we want the sunlight to hit the bunches because that helps with flavor development, but it also helps with disease control. And what we used to do is get teams of people to go along and rip off all the leaves. Anyway, we worked out if we put the sheep in the vineyard, as we normally do, at a very specific time when the berries are hard and green and the shoots have lignified. And when I mean lignified is if you get a young shoot and you grab the leaf and you pull the leaf, the whole shoot falls off. If you wait till that shoot's lignified and grab a leaf and pull that leaf, only the leaf comes off. So when the berries are hard and green and the shoots have lignified, we leave the sheep in as normal for their first 3 days. And normally after 3 days, they've eaten all the grass and we need to move it on to the next block. But what we do at this period of time, we actually leave them in that same block. And because they've got no food on the ground, they start looking elsewhere for food and they look up at the vines. And what they do is they eat the first 2 leaves that they can reach on the vines. And so that clears all of our bunches. So now all our bunches are exposed to the sunlight. So now our biodynamic vineyards with the sheep are actually cheaper to run than an industrial vineyard. So they've completely changed the landscape for us. The other thing is we now also get wool and meat off the same block of land. So it really has changed the whole process. So we've gone from a philosophical decision, which is quite costly to us, to the final outcome being something that, yes, it was a philosophical decision originally, but now it is definitely a reason to go biodynamic now is a cost factor because we are sustainable. We are producing our grapes now a lot cheaper and a lot easier. And we got 2 more incomes off the same block of land. So it really has changed it. The other cool thing about Hampshire Downs is they're what we call roamers. So with a merino, they flock together. And so if you go into the vineyard at any particular time, a merino will be in a little camp together, and you'll have camp spots where you've got a high concentration of manure in that one spot, and you get a lot of tracks through the vineyard and compaction because of merino. Hampshire Downs, because they spread out, you don't get that. You don't get those sheep camps, and you don't get those tracks so much through the vineyard. Absolute great for the vineyard. Nightmare when I go and shear, because there's always two sheep hiding in some corner, and so I end up with these two woolly sheep always wandering around. But what it reminded me of is the barrels in the winery. So in the winery, I stack all the Shiraz and I stack all the Grenache together and I stack all the Merlot together, and all these stacks were all over the winery, and it reminded me of the sheep all over the vineyard. And so that's why we call this wine the Lost Flock. So that's my long sheep story about why we call this the Lost Flock. But the sheep are really important in everything we do in the vineyard now, and they really have changed the whole landscape for us. So that's why I'm so excited to talk about them so much. That's our Lost Flock. Nice, soft, easy red. It's probably the red I drink the most of. Not my favorite red. My favorite red's the next one. And this is our Reserve Pinot. Now, Pinot is one of those wines that has been it's seen as a bit of an icon of winemaking. And that's because it's quite a light colored red and a light flavored red. And so if you make any mistake as a winemaker, it's really obvious to see in the final wine. A Shiraz or a Cabernet, the flavors are quite heavy. So if you make a mistake, the flavors will cover them up a bit. That's not the case in Pinot. Australia, New Zealand, America, we're known for making these beautiful, delicate style Pinots. You know, they remind me of ballerinas. You've got like interest and complexity, but this light, delicate sort of edge to them as well. This Pinot we're making is made in a really old school, funky Burgundian style. Lots of whole bunches, lots of stems. When I first bottle this wine, it's actually undrinkable. It's really resiny and bitter and stemsy, and it needs about 3 or 4 years in bottle to really settle down. And that's a result of using that Burgundy technique. And it's the same over in Burgundy. If you've traveled through that region at all, you'll very rarely find a Pinot being sold that's under about 3 or 4 years old. And that's because they use this technique a lot over there. I love the style it creates. It creates this big, funky sort of style. My accountant hates this wine because it takes so long to make. So it's sitting in the warehouse a long time maturing. But Chaknas Vineyard is all about making wines the way I want to make them. And so that's why we do this wine. And it is starting to age beautifully well. 3 years in, when I first released it, still had a tiny hint of bitterness to it. I drink a lot of coffee, so I didn't mind that bitterness. I quite liked it. So I decided to release it at 3 years. That's really settled down now. And one of the exciting things for me is at the moment, it's just starting to get a little hint of this cigar boxy character. And it's kind of, cigar box is like, it's like a woody character, but it's a sweet wood. It's not a dry wood. And just starting to see a bit of that in the Pinot, which is really exciting because that's one of the characters you're really trying to chase in these sort of styles of Pinot. The other thing you might see is a little bit of cloudiness. We don't filter this wine. It's a really natural wine. It's all vegan, unfiltered, old school style. I love it. So if you're into big sort of funky Pinots like I am, this is definitely your style. This is going to age long time. It's just going to get better and better and better and better. It's going to get those beautiful Forest 4 cigar boxy characters. You know, I love this style of Pinot. Next, we're going to move on to our Shiraz. It's funny, I'm just looking at all our wines, and most of our wines, the techniques we make for them are really Australian technique. Really quite European techniques. The Shiraz is pretty much the only wine we make that is made with really, you know, commercial Australian techniques. And for some reason, you know, I had to do a Shiraz because Australia is famous for a Shiraz. I love a cool climate Shiraz. And I've tried, you know, I've been making wine now for 23 years. It's all I've ever done. When I finished school in year 12, my first job was with a winery called Clonakilla in Canberra, and all I've ever done since then is make wine. And I've tried all these different techniques and all these funky ideas I've had with Shiraz, and they all add different bits of interest to the final wine. But for some reason, Shiraz always, I just love the the beauty and delicacy of a cool climate Shiraz when you don't fiddle with it. It just does not like being fiddled with. So this wine, it's destemmed, it's fermented without its stems for about 3 weeks. It's pressed off into oak. It's aged in oak for 12 to 18 months and then into bottle. So really quite basic winemaking, but it always produces this beautiful wine. And one of the things I love about cool climate Shirazes is just the way they hand you the flavor. When you try this wine, right down the middle of the tongue, right down there, you get this beautiful like line of tannin and that furriness down the middle of the tongue. And what that does is it builds structure around the wine. So if you think about some of these warm climate Shirazes, they've got structure. They've got like fruit flavors and jammy flavors and interest and texture, and like they've got all this stuff going on and complexity. And they sort of go, there you go, there it all is. In like, oh wow, yeah, it's all there. Wow. Cool climate Shiraz have all that as well. They have texture and they have complexity and they have all these flavors. But because of this structure on the tongue, they sort of hand those flavors to you slowly down the palate, and they give it to you in a more sort of, I think, refined, delicate way. And I akin it to a little bit like, if you go to a 5-star restaurant or a hatted restaurant and you get a steak and it comes out on a nice plate and a waiter nicely presents it out to you, and you've got your sides all nicely laid out and presented on the plate, and you've got all these beautiful complex flavors there. And then you go to, maybe a gourmet pub or gastro pub, and you get your steak and your sides. So you've got all the same flavors, but they hand it to you on a tray. So you've got all these similar things happening, but it's the way it's given to you that I love about cool climate Shirazes. And for me, in Australia, the hilltops, probably hilltops, Canberra, and Heathcote, probably my favorite regions for sort of cool climate Shiraz in Australia. This is part of our Creators series. So you'll notice we've got 2 labels. One is our Sustainable series, which is the one with the tractor. And the other one is our Creators series, which is the one with the barrels. The Sustainable series is 100% off our local biodynamic vineyards. And the Creators series is not 100% off our local vineyards, and not 100% off our biodynamic vineyards. So things like the Shiraz, I'm a massive fan of Shiraz. I always wanted to make a really nice, cool climate Shiraz. Because it is too cold in the Southern Highlands for Shiraz, we work really closely with some growers up in hilltops. And so that's where we get our Shiraz from. So that goes under the Creators label. So that's the difference. Let's move on to our Cabernet. Now, I am a huge fan of aged wines. I was really lucky at uni that there was only about 5 people in my degree when I went through uni, and then 2 years after me, there was about 200 people. So, I kind of became a winemaker before it was cool to be a winemaker. And as a result, I was really lucky. So one of our lecturers, Nick Bulliard, who's a master of wine, he taught us about wine tasting and different styles of wine. And when there was only 5 of us, he could bring in something that he only had 1 bottle of, and we all got to taste it because there was only 5 of us. When there was 200 people, he had to make sure he was using wines to show people that he could show to 200. So we got to try some really amazing wines when I went through. And Nick tells this story where he went to Adelaide, and he was walking through Adelaide, and there's this old pub being ripped down, and he looked into the skip bin, and he saw in the bottom of the skip bin a little 375ml bottle of wine. And he jumped in and he grabbed it and he brought it to uni for us to try. And it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So this is Penfolds before it was Penfolds, off the old McGill vineyard. And it was amazing wine. And the descriptions we use for an old wine, they sound terrible. soy sauce and fish sauce and composting guavas, and you think, oh, you're not selling this wine. But for some reason, the flavors just work so well with the fruit flavors of the wine as well. And, you know, it reminds me a little bit of when I first was at uni. I had a flatmate who was a chef, and he said to me one morning, you know what, I'm going to make us French toast. I'm like, cool, sounds good, French toast. And so he's made this French toast, and it's had um, fried bananas on top of it, bacon, and then maple syrup over it. And I just thought, hang on, what's going on here? These flavors, bacon and banana, this does not go together. What are you trying to feed me? And I tasted it and I thought, oh, wow, these flavors go so well together. That sweet and the saltiness and the fruit and the savoriness of the bacon, they all just work so well together. And that reminds me of how these flavors work with a really old wine. You've got this beautiful complexity of all these flavors that, you know, by themselves are not necessarily amazing flavors, but when you put them all together, they just work so well together. So since then, I've been obsessed with making a wine that's going to age 50 years plus. And so when I look around the world, who's famous for making really old wines? Then we look at Bordeaux. So Bordeaux, light red, so similar climate, lighter climate reds, and they make these really beautiful wines that age and age and age. Well, they created a technique that they call post-ferment maceration, and that's why we call this the post-mac Cabernet Sauvignon. And this technique basically is when you ferment a wine, you leave it with the skins and stems to ferment for about 3 weeks, which extracts all the color and flavor out of the skins. If you leave it after that ferment finishes, it's called post-ferment maceration. Now, in Australia, we probably, you know, we play around with 1-2 weeks up to a month or so, and that's sort of where we've played around with mainly. This technique from France, they do it for 12 to 18 months on skins, then into barrel for 12 to 18 months, into and the bottle for 12 to 18 months, and then it's released. So it's quite a long process. And what it does is it does two things. One, it creates a wine with super huge amounts of fruit and these really long, complex tannins that hold the structure for a really long time. So if you think about a really young Cabernet, you know, really young Cabernets, they sort of have that edgy, grippy tannin to them. Like you sometimes want to go, nah, chalky a bit, I guess. Those tannins are short chains. And as you age that age that wine in a bottle, those short chains join together to a long chain, and a long chain is soft and velvety. So that's one of the things that's happening as you age a wine. Now, if you think about a bottle, let's say we start with 100 short chain tannins, and those short chain tannins join to 50 long chain tannins, which then join to 25 even longer chain tannins. And when we've got 25 long tannins, there's not enough structure in that wine, and so it falls apart, and we call it cracking up. And so it's one of the things that happens with aged wines that go when they go bad. This technique, because we've got all the skins and stems in that tank, we've got hundreds and hundreds of these short chain tannins floating around, and they're forced together into the long chain tannins. And so when we bottle that wine, we're able to bottle it with 100 long chain tannins rather than 100 short chain tannins, and that gives us our longevity of structure. The other thing this technique does is give you this huge fruit level. So if you can imagine, a normal wine might have a fruit level of here and the savory level here. And as they age, the fruit level goes down, the savory level comes up, and the premium drinking sort of when you've got a bit of both here. And that, you know, that might be 10, 20, 30 years. If we want a wine that's going to age a long, long time, we want to start with a huge amount of fruit level so that when it levels out, it's around about that sort of 50-year mark. Now, I have absolutely no idea how the French figured this out, because when you use this technique, it's about the 3 months in when it's sitting with the skins and stems, and you get a sample out of the tank and you taste it and you think, wow, I have absolutely ruined this wine. It tastes terrible. And at that 3-month mark, I started calling around some of my winemaking friends and calling around some of the old winemakers around Australia. And they all said to me the same thing. Yeah, that's exactly what we found. We got to 3 months, tasted terrible, so we pressed it off. We put it in the barrel, got a little bit better, but we were able to blend it out. So don't worry too much. We blend it out. It's not that bad. But the French technique says to do it longer. And I just thought, wow, at the time, Trackless was a side project for me. I was doing a lot of contract work and consulting work. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do it. So I left it there for 12 months. I tasted it after 12 months. And I thought, yeah, really not that much better. And so I left it to 18 months and maybe a little bit better. And I put into barrel and wasn't really improving. And then I put into bottle and I thought, yeah, geez, am I making the right decision here? And then about 18 months in bottle, out of nowhere, bang, all this fruit flavor came out. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. So much fruit flavor came out. For the first 2 years of this wine, I actually didn't like it. It was way, way, way too fruity for me. Almost like a Sauvignon Blanc. It was incredible. But that's exactly what this technique is meant to do. It's meant to give us those huge amounts of fruit. So it's going to give us longevity to aging, these complex tannin structures. So now when I try this wine and the fruit levels sort of petered off a bit, so it's now 3-4 years in bottle, and I can't believe it's still so fruity and fresh and young. It's got these beautiful cassis, tomato leaf, capsicum sort of characters, really typical cool climate wine characters. And it's doing exactly what you would expect to do for this wine to age and age and age. So I'm really excited about this. Look, it's drinking great now, but it's just it's gonna be a wine that we can sit down in 50 years time and go, yeah, this experiment worked. Well, I hope it is anyway. We won't know for 50 years. Maybe we'll have to plan another one of these Zoom webinars in 50 years time to check whether this experiment worked. But it's doing what it's meant to so far. I'm really happy with this wine. I'm excited to taste it over the next 20, 30 years, try a few bottles. We'll actually stop selling it probably in a month or two and hold back a pallet of it so that we can re-release it later to our club members and those sorts of things. So because I want to show these older wines with people. So we got one more wine, 8,000 vintages. So 8,000 vintages is a really good wine to end on. The oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe, and there's a great book called Ancient Wine, and it talks about how they proved the oldest record of winemaking. But essentially, they found some pottery shards and some grape seeds, and they could prove beyond a doubt that they'd made wine. And so the oldest record of winemaking, 6,000 BC, so 3,000 years before Egypt. And the Georgians do a famous red style they call Kinsmurali. I was lucky enough to spend 7 years consulting in Georgia. I did 6 months in Australia, 6 months in Georgia for 7 years. So this is my homage to Georgia. This is my homage to the history of wine. This is our Australian version of Kinsmurali, which is quite a famous style over there. It's a beautiful match for a mature cheddar or that really smoky American style barbecue or a dark chocolate. It's something quite unique. We sell a lot of this to Russians and Eastern Europeans in Australia. Even in, I think it was 2002 when Russia put an embargo on Georgia, and it was still our biggest market. And we used to smuggle Kinsmurali across the border in school buses. It's that famous over there. So interesting style. I find it hard to describe it because there's nothing to compare it to. A Kinsmurali is a Kinsmurali. I guess it does have aspects of like a port. It's got that depth and complexity and that nice sort of Christmas cake character of a port, but it doesn't have the alcohol. So it's still 12%. I love that wine. Nice, fruity, soft, easy wine. So guys, that's all the wines that I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please yell out, or you can type them up on there, and I'll stay on for a little bit and answer any questions. I hope I didn't bore you with my long stories about sheep. I really enjoy these virtual tastings. We're going to be doing these now forever. This is actually going to become a main thing for our winery, and we're starting to release some new ones. I think they're up on the website already. It's a sparkling wine virtual tasting. Unfortunately, I can't put the sparkling wines in the little bottles, so we're actually going to run that like a 3-part series where we look at two bottles a night across 3 nights, but with a week in between them. And we'll look at 2 bottles, and then I'll give you, as part of the pack, you get these special closures for the bottles, so they'll last the whole week, and that way you can slowly drink the rest of the bottle across the whole week. And I'm actually going to run those sessions out at the winery, and so I can be demonstrating how we do sparkling method traditional, and talk about the history of sparkling wine and that sort of thing from the winery. So that's pretty exciting that we're going to release those. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram. I put some links up for you guys on the Zoom there. I put some links up there to our Facebook and Instagram. If you're into cheeses, I found out recently I was doing some of these tastings, and these people had these amazing cheese boxes, and there's this fantastic company called Cheese Therapy, and they started to support the Australian cheese industry during COVID. They started making these packs, and since COVID, I think they've done like 18 tons of Australian cheese. But basically, they pick 4 cheeses every month or until one of them runs out, and they send it out in this little 4 cheese pack, and they do a great job. So there's a link there for that as well. So guys, thank you very much for joining me again for another virtual tasting. I really hope you had a great time. I hope you enjoyed it. It's fun to do them. I look forward to seeing you all very soon. As I said, I am gonna just turn off live from all our other streaming things, and I'm gonna stay on Zoom now. So if anyone has any